One of the ways in which governance can be applied to the project environment is through the project lifecycle. This will impose certain restrictions and review points which will force the stakeholders to get involved, to make decisions, and to review the project holistically and determine whether it's still in the interests of the investing organization to continue with the project. The project lifecycle will dictate the phases and the approach to phasing the project, which should be appropriate to the type of investment and the level of risk of the endeavor. The project lifecycle provides the basic framework for managing a project, regardless of the technical nature of the work. All projects are different and therefore may choose a different lifecycle depending on usually the risk and scale of the project. Some industries or sectors have preferences over the type of lifecycle that they endorse. There are a number of accepted and standardized approaches to dividing projects into phases. Perhaps the simplest is a sequential relationship between the phases where one phase must finish and some sort of review is undertaken before the next phase can start. The drawback with this approach is that it is time-consuming. However, it is possible in certain circumstances to overlap some of the phases, and this has been done in many years in the construction sector where design and construct projects have been undertaken. In this situation, the design work overlaps with the construction work. The drawback and risks associated with this are that the design is not complete before the construction starts, and should there be any changes made to the design, there may already have been some work created in that field. The sequential approach is often referred to as a waterfall approach, because when drawing a plan, it resembles a waterfall. In this case, the scope and the schedule, and as a result, the costs, are defined early in the project's life cycle, and it is hoped little change will occur. It's possible to undertake a number of repeated cycles of work, a number of iterations where the life cycle is repeated, and through each iteration a greater understanding of the project needs will result in a better and more focused result. There are a number of adaptive life cycles, often referred to as agile, and these involve a high degree of stakeholder engagement and generally very short phases so that work is done very quickly, delivered and handed over so that the deliverables can be used earlier in the project lifecycle. When considering the phases which a project will go through in order to be delivered, a lot of different terminology may be used. Using very generic terminology, at least at this point, we'll discuss the project lifecycle. There is usually a short starting the project phase or stage, which culminates in the project charter being produced and approved. This will usually be followed by an organizing and preparing stage or some sort of planning phase. And at the end of this phase, the objectives of the project and the deliverables will be much better understood, and the project management plan will be assembled and presented to the sponsor for their approval. Carrying out the work requires the bulk of the cost and staffing assignments, and this is where most of the work will be done. And at the end of each phase, particularly in a large project where there may be many phases, there are usually outputs or deliverables which will be handed over to the customer, or at least accepted and validated in some way. At the end of the project, there will be a closing phase, and this is extremely important because many lessons can be learned which will affect and help in the management of future projects. At this point, all of the outputs or deliverables will be handed over, and all the documentation will be archived for reference in the future. Project phases are divisions within the project where control points or decisions about the future progress of the work are made. The phase structure can be chosen to allow the project to be segmented into logical subsets of work which may be localized or revolve around a particular technology, or may just be logically assigned to the resources available. Normally at the end of each phase there will be some transfer of ownership of the work that has been completed or some handover of the work that has been completed up until that point. The establishment of phases or stages allows the project manager to be focused on a short to medium term set of objectives and focus the team on delivering those. There are 5 process groups of activities which are undertaken during each phase. They start with an initiating process where the phase is started and the team is assembled. This rolls into a planning process, which is followed by an execution process. And these two are often shown as cyclical because as the work progresses, the monitoring and controlling process starts to provide feedback on how well the execution is following the plan. And depending on what that feedback is, there may be additional planning that is required and adjustments made to future execution, and then later more monitoring and adjustments through the controlling process. So during the middle of a phase, there are 3 processes being conducted generally at the same time. They are very distinct sets of activities, so they are separated into these 3 groups: planning, executing, and monitoring and controlling. And finally, there are a set of activities which are grouped together around the closing process, and each phase is completed in a logical and disciplined and consistent manner. This image shows an indicative relationship between the size of the resources applied to each of the process groups as the phase progresses. At the beginning of a phase, a relatively small amount of resource or amount of money or people's time is spent in the initiating phase process. This overlaps with some of the effort applied to the planning process, and this rapidly increases to a peak and then tails off. However, the planning activities may continue until almost the very end of the phase. Most of the resources are deployed in the executing process. This is where the work is undertaken. This is where the products or outputs are delivered. Simultaneously, the monitoring and controlling process group is applied. This does not require a significant amount of people to be involved, although it does depend on the size of the stage itself or the project as a whole. This monitoring and controlling process group and the executing progress group are undertaken across the bulk of the time taken to deliver the phase. Towards the end of the phase, a relatively small amount of time and effort is applied to the closing activities. And although this should not be seen as an afterthought and needs to be planned, it will be undertaken during the final few weeks of the phase. It is an extremely important set of activities because it allows feedback on performance and preparation for any subsequent phases. Stakeholders have most influence at the start of each phase and the start of the project, before any real decisions have been made. This influence is reduced as the project progresses because work is committed and technical decisions have been made, and this may limit the amount of influence that the stakeholders can exert. Similarly, risk is highest at the beginning of the project. There is most uncertainty, and as the project progresses through, for example, planning phases, that uncertainty is reduced because, again, decisions are made or information is sought, which is useful later on in the project. The stakeholder influence and risk lines indicate that the time to get stakeholders involved in the project is early on, when they can make a difference to the outputs and the final objectives. It's also important to recognize that requests for change which are made early in the project may incur relatively small costs when they're included. However, as the project moves forward and contracts are signed and commitments are made and designs are approved, the The cost of change increases significantly and very rapidly because it becomes difficult and expensive to undo some of the commitments that have been made earlier in the project. Again, this is a great example of providing a reason for stakeholders to get involved early in the project, because that is where the cost of change is least. And if they indicate the need for change, it can be accommodated with relatively little impact on the baselines for the project. The project lifecycle provides the basic framework for managing a project regardless of the technical nature of the work involved. All projects need to be managed and controlled as the work progresses, and especially if things change. Once the planning work is completed, then the executing becomes the driving force for progress, and it's essential that the monitoring and controlling processes work hand in hand with executing to provide feedback and to enable informed decisions to be made. The highlight report is often referred to as a progress report. It is a regular written or verbal report from the project manager to the project sponsor. Its purpose is to provide information to the sponsor about the progress during a particular period of the phase. As such, a standard template is usually created, which includes information around the status of progress during that period, and then more detailed information about which work packages are being undertaken and what work has been completed and what work hasn't started but was planned to have been undertaken during that period. Often these reports contain information about the following period so that the sponsor gets a clear picture of what work is intended next, and then information is provided as a summary indicating the status of the stage or phase tolerances, any requests for change or issues which are being dealt with, and risks. Normally, in a highlight report, to keep the paperwork relatively short, it would be the key risks and major issues which are discussed and recorded in this format. The information about all of the other risks and issues will be available in other places, but the purpose of the highlight report is to provide a summary of progress to the project sponsor so they can make informed decisions about potential changes or circumstances that need to be addressed. During a large project, there are likely to be many opportunities or requests for changes to be applied, and this could be generated for a number of reasons. However, in order to ensure that stakeholders receive what they understood and what they were expecting, it is important that any requests for change go through some sort of mechanism and decisions are made whether to include the change or reject it. In project management, we refer to these requests for change and ideas for change as issues. And there needs to be some way of capturing these. Normally it's in a document referred to as the issue register. The issue register is simply a table or database of all of the requests for change and their current status. Once captured, before a decision is made, somebody must examine the issue for its relevance and significance to understand the consequences of accepting this issue or rejecting it. The person who examines the issue may be the project manager, but could also be a subject matter expert, depending on what the issue actually is. Following examination, which may include reference to the sponsoring group or some key personnel, a solution needs to be proposed and relevant authority needs to make a decision. Generally speaking, this is likely to be the project sponsor. However, in certain circumstances, a change authority or lead engineer may be identified, and they may have the authority to make decisions about specific changes. Only once a decision has been made is the idea or the issue implemented. This is extremely important in terms of governance, but also in terms of stakeholder engagement. Having a mechanism in place such as this avoids a situation where quick reactions are made to particular stimuli An exception report is produced when the project manager forecasts that the progress within the current stage or phase will exceed the agreed tolerances. This means that the project manager will exceed their authority if they continue to complete this stage or phase. The report triggers information, potentially questions, and decisions made by the project sponsor or the sponsoring group. And the report needs to provide them with the information they need to understand the situation. So generally speaking, a template would include information about the cause of the deviation, why the project or phase is now moving away from the approved baseline. What are the consequences of that deviation on the progress and the ability to deliver the project within the constraints that are placed upon it? And in an effort to be proactive, what are the available options for recovery? And how does each option for recovery affect the business case, the progress within the stage or phase, and also the progress within the project itself? Generally, the project manager would make a recommendation, but the sponsor would not be obliged to accept. The activities for closing a phase or the project itself are very important because they provide the foundations for subsequent phases, or in the event of the project closing, they provide important information on performance of this project, which may be used for planning and validating the need for future work. An internal review of a completed project may provide many lessons which can be applied in future work. It can also provide many performance metrics which could be used as estimates in future planning. The evaluation of the project usually involves an assessment of the performance of the team against the baselines. Essentially, did the project deliver on time and within budget? Generally, the number and type of changes that were requested and approved may be analysed, and other lessons learned which can be used not only for the team completing this project, but for all teams within the organisation. And once a project's closed, it's very important to disseminate these lessons learned. It may be some time before it's possible to measure the benefits which have been delivered or realised as a result of completion of the project. This review is often referred to as a post-project review or post-implementation review, and may take place 6 or 12 months after the project has been complete and has transitioned into operational processes and practices. Again, many valuable lessons can be learned by conducting this, although the gap between the project finishing and this type of review may lead to it being forgotten or cancelled.